Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we're going to be throwing our lot with a very fine example of English literature in the form of this great detective fiction, detective novel entitled The Dorrington Deed Box. It's a detective fiction by Arthur Morrison about Horace Dorrington, a private detective who would have lived in the Victorian era in England, in London of course, whose really intellectual capacities, his ability at solving crime, and also his ability to use the science of deduction at the highest level would have rivaled that of Sherlock Holmes. Of course, Horace Dorrington is a very different kind of private detective than the likes of Sherlock Holmes and Martin Hewitt, in the sense that he doesn't necessarily aspire towards the same moral principles and ethical values as those other great private detectives who would have lived in the same era, such as Sherlock Holmes and, of course, Martin Hewitt. How did I become familiar with Horace Dorrington? Of course, when I was growing up, I was really addicted to watching this TV series that was being broadcast back in the days called The Rivals of Sherlock Holmes, in which quite a few detectives were featured whose, as I said, abilities at solving crime would have rivaled Sherlock Holmes. And Horace Dorrington was one of the private detectives who was featured in that particular series. And two of the stories actually were explored in that particular TV series. One was the case of the Avalanche Bicycle Company, and the other one was the case of the Mirror of Portugal. I can elaborate a little bit further on the character of Horace Dorrington and what these stories are all about, but I'd probably be spoiling the first chapter. So what I suggest is that we read the first chapter together, and then we can have a little discussion as to the character of Horace Dorrington, and we talk about the stories that we're going to explore further in this beautiful and really a great piece of English literature. One thing I gotta say is that if you've never watched the TV series, you can actually watch it on Amazon Prime, but I suggest that you don't do that. If you want to read along with me, you should probably not do that and then maybe read the novel first. So what I recommend is that you just don't go on Amazon and purchase a copy of a textbook. What I recommend is that you go on Project Gutenberg or Project Gutenberg, in which you can actually obtain a free copy of this book, and you can print it out for yourself, and you can read along with me. As I said, this is a copyright-free book, copyright-free novel that you can obtain from Project Gutenberg, so you don't have to buy it. But you probably have to print it out, or you can put it in your Kindle and read along with me. So let's start, shall we? The Dorrington Deed Box by Arthur Morrison. The Dorrington Deed Box. The narrative of Mr. James Rigby. I shall here set down in language as simple and straightforward as I can command the events which followed my recent return to England, and I shall leave it to others to judge whether or not my conduct has been characterized by foolish fear or ill-considered credulity. At the same time, I have my own opinion as to what would have been the behavior of any other man of average intelligence and courage in the same circumstances, more especially a man of my exceptional upbringing and retired habits. I was born in Australia, and I have lived there all my life till quite recently, save for a single trip to Europe as a boy in company with my father and mother. It was then that I lost my father. I was less than 9 years old at the time, but my memory of the events of that European trip is singularly vivid. My father had emigrated to Australia at the time of his marriage and had become a rich man by singularly fortunate speculations in land and in about Sydney. As a family, we were most uncommonly self-centered and isolated. From my parents, I never heard a word as to their relatives in England. Indeed, to this day, I do not as much as know what was the Christian name of my grandfather. I have often supposed that some serious family quarrel or great misfortune must have preceded or accompanied my father's marriage. Be that as it may, I was never able to learn anything of my relatives, either on my mother's or my father's side. Both parents, however, were educated people, and indeed I fancy that their habit of seclusion must first have arisen from this circumstance. Since the colonists about them in the early days, excellent people as they were not as a class distinguished for extreme intellectual culture. My father had his library stocked from England and added to by fresh arrivals from time to time. And among his books, he would pass most of his days, taking, however, now and again an excursion with a gun in search of some new specimen to add to his museum of natural history, which occupied 3 long rooms in our house by the Lane Cove River. I was, as I have said, 8 years of age when I started with my parents on a European tour, and it was in the year 1873. We stayed but a short while in England at first arrival, intending to make a longer stay on our return from the continent. We made our tour taking Italy last, and it was here that my father encountered a dangerous adventure. We were at Naples, and my father had taken an odd fancy for a picturesque-looking ruffian who had attracted his attention by a complexion unusually fair for an Italian, and in whom he professed to recognize a likeness to Tasso the poet. This man became his guide in excursions about the neighborhood of Naples, though he was not one of the regular corps of guides, and indeed seemed to have no regular occupation of a definite sort. Tasso, as my father always called him, seemed a civil fellow enough and was fairly intelligent, but my mother disliked him extremely from the first, without being able to offer any very distinct reason for her aversion. In the event, her instinct was proved true. Tasso, his correct name, by the way, was Tommaso Marino, persuaded my father that something interesting was to be seen at the Astroni crater, 4 miles west of the city, or thereabouts. Persuaded him, moreover, to make the journey on foot, and the two accordingly set out. All went well enough till the crater was reached, and then, in a lonely and broken part of the hill, the guide suddenly turned and attacked my father with a knife. His intention, without a doubt, being murder and the acquisition of the Englishman's valuables. Fortunately, my father had a hip pocket with a revolver in it, for he had been warned of the danger a stranger might at that time run wandering in the country about Naples. He received a wound in the flesh of his left arm in an attempt to ward off a stab, and fired at wrestling distance, with the result that his assailant fell dead on the spot. He left the place with all speed, tying up his arm as he went, saw to British consul at Naples, and informed him of the whole circumstances. From authorities, there was no great difficulty. An examination or two, a few signatures, some particular exertions on the part of the consul, and my father was free so far as the officers of the law were concerned. But while these formalities were in progress, no less than 3 attempts were made on his life. 2 by knife and 1 by shooting, and in each his escape was little short of miraculous. For the dread ruffian Marino had been a member of the dreaded Camorra and the Camorristi, or Camorristi, were eager to avenge his death. To anybody acquainted with the internal history of Italy, more particularly the history of the old kingdom of Naples, the name of the Camorra will be familiar enough. It was one of the worst and most powerful of the many powerful and evil secret societies of Italy, and had none of the excuses for existence which have been from time to time put forward on behalf of the others. It was a gigantic club for the commission of crime and the extortion of money. So powerful was it that it actually imposed a regular tax on all food material entering Naples. A tax collected and paid with far more regularity than were any of the taxes due to the lawful government of the country. The carrying of smuggled goods was a monopoly of the Camorra, a perfect organization existing for the purpose throughout the kingdom. The whole population was terrorized by this detestable society, which had no less than 12 centers in the city of Naples alone. It contracted for the commission of crime just as systematically and calmly as a railway company contracts for the carriage of merchandise. A murder was so much according to circumstances, with extras for disposing of the body. Arson was dealt in profitably. Maimings and kidnappings were carried out with promptitude and dispatch. And any diabolical outrage imaginable was a mere matter of price. One of the staple vocations of the concern was, of course, brigandage. After the coming of Victor Emmanuel and the fusion of Italy into one kingdom, the Camorra lost some of its power, but for a long time gave considerable trouble. I have heard that in the year after the matters I'm describing 200 Camorriciti were banished from Italy. Or I should say Camorristi. Camorristi. As soon as the legal forms were complied with, my father received the broadest possible official hints that the sooner and the more secretly he left the country, the better it would be for himself and his family. The British consul, too, impressed it upon him that the law would be entirely unable to protect him against the machinations of the Camorra, and indeed it needed but little persuasion to induce us to leave, for my poor mother was in a state of constant terror lest we were murdered together in our hotel, so that we lost no time in returning to England and bringing our European trip to a close. In London, we stayed at a well-known private hotel near Bond Street. We had been but 3 days here when my father came in one evening with a firm conviction that he had been followed for something like 2 hours, and followed very skillfully too. More than once he had doubled suddenly with a view to confront the pursuers, who he felt were at his heels. But he had met nobody of a suspicious appearance. The next afternoon, I heard my father telling my governess, who was traveling with us, of an unpleasant-looking man who had been hanging about opposite the hotel door, and who she felt sure had afterwards been following her and my father as they were walking. My mother grew nervous and communicated her fears to my father. He, however, pooh-poohed the thing and took little thought of its meaning. Nevertheless, the dogging continued, and my father, who was never able to fix upon the persons who caused the annoyance, indeed, he rather felt their presence by instinct, as one does in such cases, than otherwise grew extremely angry and had some ideas of consulting the police. Then one morning, my mother discovered a little paper label stuck on the outside of the door of the bedroom occupied by herself and my father. It was a small thing, circular, and about the size of a 6-penny piece, or even smaller, but my mother was quite certain that it had not been there when she last entered the door the night before, and she was such terrified. For the label carried a tiny device, drawn awkwardly in ink, a pair of knives of curious shape, crust, the sign of the Camorra. Nobody knew anything of this label or how it came where it had been found. My mother urged my father to place himself under the protection of the police at once, but he delayed. Indeed, I fancy he had a suspicion that the label might be the production of some practical joker staying at the hotel who had heard of his Neapolitan adventure. It was reported in many newspapers and designed to give him a fright. But that very evening, my poor father was found dead, stabbed in a dozen places in a short, quiet street not 40 yards from the hotel. He had merely gone out to buy a few cigars of a particular brand, which he fancied, at a shop 2 streets away, and in less than half an hour of his departure, the police were at the hotel door with the news of his death, having got his address from letters in his pockets. It is not part of my present design to enlarge on my mother's grief or to describe in detail the incidents that followed my father's death, for I'm going back to this early period of my life merely to make more clear the bearings of what has recently happened to myself. I think at this point we've come to a good pause, and we'll proceed further tomorrow. Thank you very much for being with me. If you haven't done so already, please do subscribe to the channel. The story is getting really, really exciting. As you can tell, it's kind of building up gradually into something very, very interesting and very enthralling. And we'll see what happens to our friend whose father, unfortunately, was murdered at the hands of the Camorra, the murder society of Italy. Yeah, so we'll continue tomorrow. Thank you very much for being with me, and I wish you a wonderful evening. Take care. Bye.